For Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I just want to pick up where my good friend, the member for Jagga Jagga, left off in terms of women marching and women being angry and the voices of young women which are demanding to be heard. Just to make this observation, not long after the March for Justice, I was sitting in a doctor's reception waiting for an appointment, and they always play something on the television for everyone when they're waiting. And there was a documentary on about the women's marches and the feminist movement in the 1970s. And they showed some of the meetings of the women planning their actions and planning their marches. And one thing that really struck me was how excited and happy they were, and how full it seemed watching the documentary of a sense that they were going to make change. And that whilst they were angry at, let's face it, centuries of women not being treated equally to men, they also seemed to be full of positivity and hope. And as I said, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. Some of the meetings looked like almost like a party. And then you fast forward to 2020 and 2021, and particularly the March for Justice, when really the aims of those women you would think would have been fulfilled by now. And I think that the pervading emotions amongst the women who marched and the women who watched and supported the march were anger and disappointment. Anger and disappointment that it was still happening, and that after all of those decades later, in some circumstances, it had got worse. But the other thing that happened with the March for Justice is that it was the voices of young women, and disturbingly and shamefully young women who had experienced sexual assault or harassment, but it was the voices of those women that were amplified. And as the member for Jagga Jagga said, they demanded to be heard, and they demanded to be heard without apology, and they were inspiring. And I think that in some ways that goes to the heart of one of the observations and recommendations of Kate Jenkins in her Set the Standard report about the need to end a culture of entitlement and impunity. Because ultimately we know that sexual harassment and assault and violence, be it in families, be it domestically, be it in the street, be it in the workplace, the private sphere or the public sphere, ultimately it comes down to gender inequality and a belief in entitlement or impunity and superiority, and that for everything else that we can and are doing and should do to make workplaces, homes, streets, sports clubs, theatres safe for women, fundamentally what we have to do is continue to work towards gender equality. And that goes for this parliament as well. So this legislation is supported wholeheartedly and in a bipartisan manner because it is a step towards fixing the problems that clearly have existed in this workplace for far too long. And it's a welcome step, as was the acknowledgement and apology by the presiding officers and leaders of parties and independents that happened earlier in this parliament. But it's not enough. Laws on their own don't lead to changes in culture. Words on their own don't lead to changes in culture. And we've heard a lot of words from a lot of us about changing the culture and about a commitment to do so. So whilst this legislation is a good start, and while the words of apology and acknowledgement are a good start, they are not enough alone or together to change the pervading culture, particularly to change the pervading culture of entitlement and impunity that exists too much in politics, and whilst I'm sure there are examples of women behaving badly, that has existed too much in the male-dominated activities of politics and parliament. Words alone and laws alone don't change the culture, but you know what does? Actions change the culture. Demonstrated and lived attitudes change the culture. And Deputy Speaker, if we really want Parliament to be the standard bearer for safe and respectful workplaces, and if anyone doesn't, then I ask why they're here, but if we really want the Parliament to be the standard bearer for safe and respectful workplaces, then the people who are here, who have been elected to be the leaders of this workplace, are absolutely responsible for setting that standard and demonstrating it in everything we do, in the way we interact with our staff, in the way we interact with the staff of other parliamentarians, in the way we interact with the people who work in this chamber, who clean our offices, who are the secretariats of our committees, who serve us coffee and food in the canteens and the coffee trolleys, who work in the press gallery. We have to be responsible for setting the standard and demonstrating it in the way we interact with everyone. And we have to be responsible for setting the standard and demonstrating it in this Parliament. And I'm really pleased that there is a committee that's been established to look at establishing a code of conduct for those of us who are elected to work here and that work here. And my personal opinion is that code of conduct needs to also look at the way we conduct ourselves in this Parliament, and in particular, in the most watched part of this Parliament, in question time. You only have to look at the question time that we all had to sit through today to see examples of bullying, to see examples of verbal abuse, to see examples of behaviour being modelled that is the antithesis of the behaviour that we should be modelling if we want to set the standard. Too often, the behaviour that's engaged in politics in this chamber and outside of this chamber falls so far short of the ambitions of the Set the Standard report and the legislation that we are all supporting today, that it's not only depressing, it's just not surprising that so many Australians are lacking in trust and are falling prey to the lies and the misinformation and the conspiracy theories of people who are taking advantage of that dissatisfaction with politics for their own agendas and their own aggrandisement. So how do we establish a workplace that abhors bullying, that abhors harassment and verbal abuse, unless the leaders of that workplace, which are us, but in particular are the Prime Minister and the ministers in his cabinet, displayed those very behaviours during all of their interactions as Prime Minister and ministers, including in this Parliament and in question time. That's what needs to change, as well as this welcome legislation and the legislation I anticipate that will follow as we work to implement all of the recommendations of the Set the Standard report, as the Labor caucus has unanimously committed to do. And while we're at it, we need to implement the Respect at Work recommendations, because this workplace needs to be safe for everyone, and every workplace needs to be safe for everyone. And when we're given the tools to do it by the experts, then we need to take those tools up and use them. I want to finish my contribution by saying that these are the behaviours that I would like to see in a code of conduct that talk about honesty and transparency and responsibility and respect. That's not too much to ask of our parliamentarians. And I want to join with others to say we are nothing without our staff, those in our electorate offices, those in parliamentary offices, and the staff that we don't employ but that work in this building and in the business that we're in. We are the face and the voice often of the work that is done by people who are often young and enthusiastic and eager and smart and hopeful, and people that we should be lifting up, not people who we should be crushing. We are responsible, no matter what the age of the people who work for us, for the way in which they are treated by us and by others. And I want to lend my admiration and support to the brave and tough young women who made a decision that I can't imagine how hard it was to make, to speak publicly about their experiences, which led to this Set the Standard report being delivered after an investigation. And to everyone who participated in that and had to relive, from the stories that we've seen in that report, horrendous behaviours in order to make it better for other people. That takes a strength and I hope a resilience that is hard for many of us to imagine, but it also takes a selflessness that is more than admirable. So let us here all set the standard. Today, tomorrow, during the election campaign, when we're in government, when we're in opposition, when we're at the footy club, the local play, when we're in question time. Because if we don't set the standard and live up to that standard, how can we expect others to? Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the honourable member for